Meow, 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 meow.
Hey everybody! Welcome to a long weekend edition of the Jayda InStitches show. This Monday we are celebrating Family Day, which means there are going to be all sorts of fun outdoor winter activities for the whole family to take part in. So we thought this would be a great week to make a super cute hat to wear while you're outside having fun in the snow. I'm going to walk you through how to make this hat for any sized head. And if you're interested in purchasing a written copy of this pattern, you'll find it available in our Etsy shop. The link for our shop will be in the description box down below, and this pattern will include very explicit directions on how to make it for any sized head. So let's grab some bright, cheerful colors, grab your hook, let's head on over to the craft table, and we will stitch up some adorable little cat-eared hats together. In order to make our cat ear beanie hats, you want approximately 150 grams of a medium worsted weight yarn. I'm using acrylic, but you could use cotton or wool. I say 150 grams because you want to account for the differences in medium weights and also our personal stitch tension, and the smaller your head, the less yarn you're going to need. You also want a small amount of yarn in the same fiber content as your main hat in a different color for the inner ear. You might find a measuring tape handy for this project. You're going to want a handful of stitch markers or safety pins, a yarn needle, a pair of scissors, and we're using a 5.5 millimeter hook or an I-9. And once you've got all that together, we can get started. We're going to begin with a slip knot. Whether you're making this hat for a child or an adult, we're going to begin by chaining 8. Once you have 8 chains, find the first chain from the hook, skip over it, find the second, and single crochet into it. You're going to single crochet into each chain all the way back to the beginning, and you'll have 7 single crochets at the end of row 1. At the end of row 1 of the brim, you should have 7 stitches, and you should have 7 stitches at the end of every row as we work through the brim. We're going to chain 1 and turn our work at the end of every row of the brim. And for row 2 and every row now throughout the rest of the brim portion of our hat, we are only going to work into the back loops of each stitch. So if you look at your stitches, you'll see that each stitch consists of a front loop and a back loop. And the back loop is always the loop furthest away from you. So if we work a single crochet into the back loops, you put your hook through the back loop of a stitch and single crochet into it. You're going to single crochet into the back loops only, all the way across row 2 and every row of the brim, and I will catch up with you at the end. At the end of row 2, you should have something that looks like this. There's a ridge that sits out between row 1 and row 2. Chain 1 and turn like you do for every row in the brim, and then you're going to do the same thing. You're going to single crochet into the back loops only, all the way back. And you're going to repeat this process until your brim piece is long enough to fit comfortably around your head with a little bit of stretching. So not a lot of stretching, but a little bit of stretching. You don't want the brim to be too loose, so you want to make sure that you stretch it just a little bit to fit around your head. And if you are making this for another person, then you want to have the measuring tape handy so that you can measure the length of your brim piece against your measuring tape. And I'll show you a little bit more of that when we get there. Once you've crocheted enough rows that the length of your brim wraps comfortably all the way around your head with a little bit of stretch, not too much, but a little bit. The reason for this is we don't want our brim to be too loose or too tight. Alternatively, if you're making it for someone else, take your measuring tape and lay it flat. Find the length that your circumference needs to be. So for example, this one needs to be 22 inches. Place one end at the end of your measuring tape, and with a little bit of stretching, it should equal the circumference length that you need. So a little bit of stretching, not too much. The next thing you want to do is count up all of your rows and write that number down. That number will indicate how many stitches, more or less, you should have in each row of the upper part of your hat going forward. Now we're going to connect both short ends of our brim and make a little seam. So whether you have an even number or an odd number of rows in your brim will indicate whether your little start tail is at the top or the bottom. It doesn't matter, so don't worry if yours looks different than mine. Make sure you haven't twisted your brim piece. Bring both short ends together, and we're going to continue working through the back loops only. If you haven't chained a chain at the end of your last row yet, do so. You want one chain at the end of your last row. Pair up both ends. You should have the same number of stitches in both sides. So there's 7 chains, or the bottom of those 7 chains from our foundation chain row, and there's 7 single crochets in my last row. Pick up the back loop of the next stitch and the corresponding stitch on the opposite row. Slip stitch through both of them at the same time, and then do it again. Pick up the next back loop only and the corresponding stitch on the other side, so that there's your back loop, there's the corresponding stitch, and slip stitch back through all of them. Keep your slip stitches nice and loose. You don't want this to be a tight seam. And just gradually slip stitch your way down all 7 stitches at the back of your hat. Once you've seamed up the back of your brim, pull up on the loop, flip your brim inside out, and if you have to, bring your yarn through the brim of your hat, just so that you have it all sitting up top ready to work. So what we've done now is we've put that seam on the inside of our hat, and now we're going to continue working. So grab your hook, put your hook back through the loop, and we're going to chain 1 and single crochet in the same place that we just chained 1 out of. So find a piece of that seam and work a single crochet. And here's where that number of rows in your brim comes in handy. You want to work a single crochet in the edge of each of those rows all the way around. So if you had 53 or 54 rows in your brim, you've got 1 extra stitch in your seam, and then you should have another 54 or 53 or however many rows around, more stitches to do. So for me, that's 54. I'm going to add, there's my seam, so I'll have 55 stitches more or less at the end of the first row of the upper part of my hat. But that count doesn't need to be exact. What's more important is that you have a nice even row all the way around that doesn't tighten up your brim or make it too loose that it spreads apart. So try and aim for 1 single crochet in the edge of each of those rows of the brim all the way around. Take your time, and I'll catch up with you. Once you've single crocheted in each row edge all the way around, including the seam where we started, take a moment and count up all of those stitches. That's the number that you should have at the end of every row going forward until we're nearly finished our hat. So your stitch count for each row will remain constant. We are not joining our rows with a slip stitch. We are working in the round. So you will work directly into the first stitch, that was the stitch of row 1, for the first stitch of row 2. And if you have trouble seeing where your start point is, if you've got your little tail hanging down here, that's a good indicator of where the beginning and ends of all your rows are. But if that is hidden, then you might want to take a moment and put a little stitch marker in on the first or last stitch of row 1, just for a visual, so you know where all of your rows begin and end. You're going to continue to single crochet in every stitch all the way around, around and around and around, for as many rows as it takes to get to the right depth that is just 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch below the complete desired depth. What am I saying? Well, if you're making this for a child, you want to crochet until your hat depth measures approximately 15 centimeters or 6 inches from the bottom of your brim to the top, and then you're going to pause. If you're doing a woman's hat, it's 19 centimeters or 7.5 inches, and if it's for a man, it's 20 centimeters or 8 inches. So work that single crochet in every stitch all the way around until the desired depth, and then we're going to just work the last 3 rows of our hat to finish it off. Once you've single crocheted around and around and around and your hat has met the desired height or the desired depth, so from the bottom of the brim to the top, should be approximately 15 centimeters or 6 inches for a child, 19 centimeters or 7.5 inches for a woman, or 20 centimeters or 8 inches for a man. So that's what we should be at right about now. And those numbers are approximate. You should be somewhere in the ballpark. We are now going to work the last 3 rows of the hat. But before we do that, we need to add some stitch markers. So you're going to flatten your hat so that the middle back seam is in the middle. So flatten your hat so you're looking at the middle back seam. And you're going to put your first stitch marker right up here on that stitch. So on the stitch that's pretty much directly on top, so there's my stitch marker, it's directly on top of the middle back seam. Then you're going to take a stitch marker and put one on the stitch that's right on one edge, so the far left side and the far right side. And the last one, as you've probably guessed, is going to go on the stitch directly opposite the stitch that's the middle back seam. So there's the middle back seam stitch. I'm just going to flip my hat over and mark the stitch that's pretty much directly opposite it. So what we've done is we've separated the hat into 4 even sections, mostly even sections. It doesn't have to be exact. So this is the 3rd last row. You're going to do what we've pretty much been doing all the way along and single crochet into every single stitch all the way around. So work another row of single crochet and I'll catch back up with you back round at the beginning. Your 3rd last row ends back round at the beginning. So there's the stitch marker that indicates where my back seam is. And our 2nd last row begins with a single crochet, 2 stitches together. So into the next 2 stitches, you're going to pick up a loop in each of those next 2 stitches, yarn over, and pull back through everything. Now you're going to single crochet in every stitch all the way up to your next stitch marker. Once you arrive at the next stitch marker, you're going to single crochet 2 stitches together. And then you're going to repeat for the next 2 stitch markers. Single crochet in each stitch all the way up to the next stitch marker, and then single crochet 2 stitches together over top of where that stitch marker is. Do that round to the last stitch marker, and then finish single crocheting your 2nd last row, and you'll end back where the first stitch marker is, marking the back seam. Your 2nd last row ends back at the first stitch marker, which indicates where your middle back seam is. So you have single crocheted 2 together 4 times. Once at the beginning, once at each side, and once at the very opposite stitch marker from your middle back seam. So you have decreased 4 stitches. So whatever your regular stitch count was for a regular row, subtract 4 stitches and that should be your new stitch count. For last row, this is the last row in our hat, we are going to repeat what we just did. So you're going to single crochet 2 stitches together at each of the 4 markers and single crochet into each stitch in between. So you're decreasing another 4 stitches in total at the end of your last row. And that's all you need to do for the last row. Make sure you decrease or single crochet 2 stitches together at each of the 4 stitch markers, and I'll catch back up with you at the end. Your last row ends in line with the stitch marker that indicates where your back seam is. We have a few more single crochets to add before we get to seaming up the top of our hat. What you're going to do is just single crochet across to the 2nd stitch marker, and then you're going to pause there. So this isn't going to change your stitch count, which should now, your final stitch count for each row should be in fact 8 stitches less than what your original stitch count was. So it's not really that important, so don't be panicking about final numbers or anything, but we have decreased a total of 8 times in the last 2 rows. But we are single crocheting around to the 2nd stitch marker. This would be the stitch marker on the left side of the hat if you're a right-handed crocheter, or the right side of the hat if you're a left-handed crocheter. Either way, it's the first stitch marker you come to at the side, and now you're going to pause. You're going to lay your hat down and flatten it out. So you should be looking at the front now. So this stitch marker indicates the front. There's my little seam at the back. Flatten your hat out. You're going to chain one, and holding both of the sides of the top together. So now that we've pinched the top of our hat together, we're going to single crochet through the top of both sides all the way along the top. So what you're going to do is you're going to pick up the first 2 stitches that mirror each other and single crochet through them. And you should have an even number all the way across. And just steadily work your way across, picking up both sides at the same time. Try to get the whole stitch and single crocheting. So what we're doing is we're just seaming up, seaming up the top of our cat hat in preparation for adding some ears. Once you complete a single crochet in each set of stitches all the way across the top of your hat, and you work the last one in the last set, you're going to slip stitch into the same set of stitches that you worked your last single crochet, and then fasten off your yarn. And take a moment to pull it to the inside of your hat. So you might want to grab your yarn needle, you want to poke it through onto the inside of your hat, flip your hat inside out and weave your tail in back and forth on the inside of your hat. And also, you can take a moment to remove all your stitch markers. Next, we're going to make the inner ears. So we want to make 2 of these that are identical, and you're going to use the other color that you have for your inner ear. So I've got a nice light pink here. We're going to start with a slip knot. If you're making these for an adult, you're going to chain 8. If you're making these for a child-sized hat, you're going to chain 7. Once you have 8 chains for an adult ear or 7 chains for a child's ear, skip over the first chain, find the second one, and single crochet into each stitch across. At the end of row 1, you should have 7 stitches for an adult hat and 6 stitches for a child's hat. At the end of row 1, chain 1, turn your work, and regardless of the size of hat you're making these ears for, you're going to single crochet the first 2 stitches of the second row together. So pick up a loop in each of those first 2 stitches and single crochet. You're going to single crochet across row 2 until you get to the last 2 stitches, and then you're going to single crochet those last 2 stitches together. So when you get to the end of row 2 and your last 2 stitches are looking at you, single crochet 2 together across those last 2 stitches. At the end of row 2, you should have 5 stitches for an adult ear and 4 stitches for a child's ear. Chain 1 and turn. You're going to repeat row 2 for row 3, so single crochet the first 2 stitches together at the beginning of the row, single crochet to the last 2 stitches, and single crochet those 2 together as well. So you've decreased on either end. For an adult ear, you should have 3 stitches, and for a child's ear, you should have 2. Chain 1 and turn. If you have a child's ear, you should have 2 stitches, so you're going to single crochet 2 together across those 2 stitches. For an adult ear, you're going to single crochet 3 together. So we're going to pick up a stitch, or a loop I should say, in each of those 3 stitches, and then yarn over and pull back through all. And that is the inner ear made. You're going to make another one exactly like that. You're going to take a long tail, so give yourself at least 10 inches of tail, make that 20.5 centimeters. This is so you can sew the inner ear onto the front of your hat. So give yourself a nice long tail for sewing, fasten off, and take a moment to weave in the little short tail down here, back and forth across that first row, and then make number 2 the same. Once you've made each of your inner ear pieces, you want to place them on the front of your hat in the top corners. And each of side of your inner ear should be about 1 centimeter, maybe 1.5 centimeters from the top edge and from the side edge. You can sort of eyeball this. It doesn't have to be exact, but you don't want them right up on the edges. You want them just inside a little bit. And if you need to pin them into place, you can do that. Or if you're like me and you like to hold things in place with your thumbs, you can do that too. Thread up the long tail you left with your yarn needle, And we're going to sew all the way around the inner ear by picking up a loop, so a top piece of a stitch on the hat, and then the edge of the inner ear piece. Sort of hold it every once in a while out from you to make sure that you've got it still in the same place and it's not moving on you, or you still like the place that it's in. If you find this tricky, you can pin the ear into place and work all the way through the front and sort of through the front piece and to the inside of your hat, but be sure, no matter which method you're using, to not go through all the way through your hat. You don't want to see any stitches on the other side. You just want that to be on the front. So you want to sew your inner ear piece down to the top corner, both sides of your hat, only to the front of your hat, so not all the way through. Once you've sewn all the way around the inner ear, taking care to not sew all the way through your hat, you can just knot your yarn. So create a little knot with your yarn. Make sure it's nice and tiny and tight, and then you can weave it into your inner ear piece. So you can actually weave it on into the inside of your inner ear piece, or just through some of those stitches that you have out front. Either way, your little tail won't be seen. You can just bury what's left on the inside of your inner ear piece. And once you've got that all cleaned up, you can go ahead and put the second one on. Once you have both your inner ears sewn into place and nothing shows through to the back, we are almost done. Now all we have to do is create the actual ear part of the hat. So you're going to take around 17.5 centimeters or 7 inches of the yarn that you use to make your hat. So the same color as your hat. Thread it up in your yarn needle, and you're going to take your needle on the inside of your hat and poke it through a stitch around the edge of your hat, just underneath where your inner ear is. So this might take a little poking around, but you want basically to create a line that runs right underneath your inner ear in a fairly straight diagonal. So I might want to come down just a little bit more. So right about there. So take your needle, pull it through just a little bit, but not all the way. Flip your hat inside out so that you can see where the yarn has come through, so what stitch basically we're going to use. And then keep your thumb on that stitch. You can pull your needle through, and this is where we're going to knot the end of our yarn. So just pick up the inside loops of that stitch and create a simple knot. So I like to knot my yarn twice to make sure it's not going to go anywhere. And when you're finished all the sewing, you can weave in all of your little short tails. So you can leave your little short tail hanging. Then you can poke your needle back through to the outside and straighten your hat back out. And now all we're going to do is we're going to sew all the way through both sides of the hat on an angle all the way up. And if you put your yarn through a stitch maybe a bit too low, you can just weave it back up a little bit. There you go. And now, starting on the edge with your yarn on the outside of your hat, you're going to do a running stitch. So a running stitch is a straight stitch where you go back and forth through the fabric. So I've come all the way out to the back side of my hat. Looking at the front, I'm going to bring my needle back out in a nice straight line. So a running stitch runs in a nice straight line. I'm going to run this stitch all the way across, so through both sides, all the way up to the top of my hat, a nice straight line underneath where my inner ear sits. So it helps to kind of keep an eye on where you're putting your needle. Remember, you're running all the way to the back of your hat. Don't pull too tightly, but you do want to make your stitches small enough that they're not really going to show. Because it's the same color of yarn, you're really not going to be able to see where those stitches are. So that's a benefit. Just steadily work your way all the way across up to the top of the hat in a nice straight line. When you get up to the top You're going to poke your needle down into the inside of your hat. So put your hand in there. Put your needle into the inside of your hat. There it is. Pull it all the way through. And now in the same place where your yarn has come out, you're going to knot your yarn to the inside of your hat and then take a moment and weave in both tails. And that would be the tails from where you knotted on and where you knotted off. And you'll notice there should be a nice seam there because what you've done is create an ear. Ba-ba. So when it's sitting on your head, this little ear stays nice and pinched and actually looks like a cat ear at the side of your head. So go ahead, knot off, weave in, and then do the exact same thing on the other side for your second ear. Once you've sewn up both sides, remember that you want to make sure that that running stitch runs all the way through both edges so that when you open your hat, you actually have an ear on either side, and that should show on both sides. Take a moment to weave in any of your little short tails, so ones that might be hanging off your brim or the little bits from your sewing job up here. Make sure everything's woven in nice and neat and tidy. And you are done your little cat ear beanie. And there you go, a cat-eared hat for yourself or anyone else in the family. I love this hat so much, I made myself one in gray too, and I thought I'd show it to you because I love how that light gray looks with the bright pink inner ear. Recently, a lot of you have been asking how you can help support us here at the Jayda InStitches show, and we have 3 easy options. You can purchase a pattern over at our Etsy shop, you can buy a t-shirt or a tote bag over at our Teespring shop, or you can pop over to our website and give us a tip in our digital tip jar. And we'll have direct links to all 3 of those options in the description box down below. And we thank you from the very bottom of our hearts for your appreciation and support. We really, really appreciate it. And that's it for this week, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful weekend and you have some fun outside, whether it's warm or cold, in your cute new meow hat. We'll see you soon here on the Jayda InStitches show. Until then, stay safe, stay crafty, and have an awesome week. Bye, everybody.
Meow, 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 meow. Nailed it.